Have you ever been to an event you're looking forward to and it didn't turn out the way you expected? In fact, it didn't really turn out at all and you'd rather it never happened. There's a couple in the news in the last couple of weeks who had planned to get married in August 2020, delayed their wedding by 2 years. The bride was ready to leave the bridal suite to get married when she got the call that the roof of the venue was on fire. We thought we were finally going to get there and got so close. And that's the absolute killer, said the bride. The couple don't know what they're going to do next, but they're still planning to get married at a later date. Nearly, but not quite. The sigh of joy and relief was paused before it began. I wonder how they're feeling now. Over the last 2 years, I've been holding on to the hope of resurrection and all that would symbolise for coming out of the pandemic. Our first Easter in lockdown was quite soon after the restrictions came in, those really strict restrictions when it felt like the country had come together. We were all stuck in. I recorded an early morning service from my spare room, released it at 6:30 a.m. and watched it in bed. I released the service on the website at 10 and then went out for my daily exercise. Remember those days when we did that? And everywhere was silent. There were some pigeons gathered on the parade underneath one of the trees. The only gathering there was on that resurrection day. There was so much hope that this wouldn't last long. And in the silence of the day, the smell of resurrection was there. But it wasn't the first Easter here I hoped it would be. Last year we'd moved on. We got used to being told what to do, liked it less each day. But by Palm Sunday, there were bits of sparkling hope around. Singing outdoors while sensibly distance was allowed. So on Easter Sunday, we had our first sing together at 9 a.m. before gathering on Zoom for our service together. It was good to celebrate resurrection with singing in worship. It was good to gather as community. It was helped in the knowledge that this had to be the last weird one. But it wasn't quite the second Easter I hoped it would be. So this year, we decided that we would go at it fully, doing all the things that we love to do, eating together, worshipping together, celebrating together, egg hunting together, being together before I go off on a long sabbatical walk and process all that has happened in the last few years. I was hoping to find my Holy Week and Resurrection Sunday home again, to feel comfortable, to receive that hope as well as speak it. But then I tested positive for COVID on Palm Sunday, and for me, it all came tumbling down. It wasn't quite the third Easter here I hoped it would be. But then, initially, I'm reminded in our Bible passage today, that first Resurrection Sunday was, at least at first, for many of Jesus' followers, a story of disappointment. The road to Emmaus is a story that starts with a bit of first Easter Sunday disappointment. The news was confusing. It didn't make sense. They knew it was meant to be a big weekend, but they really hadn't grasped the news yet and couldn't find the hope that they'd had just a few days ago before Jesus died. They'd gone through a massive trauma, seen their leader and teacher horrifically tortured and crucified, and there seemed to be nothing they could do now. And they had a huge amount of processing to do. The pieces of the jigsaw needed putting together to make sense of any of this and see if it could be salvaged. But they need to get their heads round it first. Not quite the first Easter they hoped it would be. When we've been through a traumatic experience, we all process it differently. Now, I'm not saying that my experiences of not being able to fully celebrate Easter are anything like what the early followers of Jesus were experiencing in the confusion of the gradually seeping out news on that Sunday. But I think in the stories of the encounters with the resurrected Jesus in Luke, we can begin to relate to some of the wrestling and ways of dealing with trauma that the disciples had. And as we continue to process how things have changed and how things are continuing to change as a result of everything that has happened and everything that continues to happen in this broken world, this sick world, We might find some guidance and hope in the stories that are here. So when difficult things happen, what do you do? Well, some of us need to be alone. In John's account of the resurrection, Mary Magdalene sticks around in the garden trying to process all that she has seen. And it is there she finds the reality of Jesus and is able to make sense of what happens. Jesus needed time to think. Jesus helped her with that as he called her by her name. Some of us need to be with others who have experienced the same thing. The disciples gathered back in the upper room, probably the room where they'd shared a meal with Jesus on Maundy Thursday. They needed one another. They needed companionship and they needed to talk it out. They found safety in numbers and they locked the door because they wanted to be together and they wanted to be safe. And then there's some of us who just need to have a walk and go home. Some of us need to find familiarity and safety and a place that we know to process. I'm that kind of person. I relate so much more to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, walking in companionship, looking for a safe space, find their way to where they're staying that night, whether it's home or somewhere else safe. A good walk and then a meal afterwards is where I find a lot of my answers. And it's where these two on this road find their answers too. Now my sabbatical is going to conclude, I hope, a lot of good walks and probably good meals too, with others who I haven't seen for a long time but who support me in life. Because that's where I make sense of the world. And that's where I can process the jigsaw of the last few years. Now, we don't know for sure who these disciples are. Well, we do we know one of the disciples' names. That's Cleopas. Cleopas is not one of the 12 closest to Jesus, but was clearly around for the events of Holy Week, as he knows all that has happened. He was probably there all the way through the entry on Palm Sunday, to the throwing over the tables in the temple, to the curse of the fig tree, to the anointing of Jesus' feet with perfume, to the upper room on Maundy Thursday, to Gethsemane, to the crucifixion on Friday, to Jesus' body being laid in the tomb, to the unknowing after that. He knew what had happened and needed to process it. The other disciple, well, traditionally, probably because of the final verse that we read today, people think that it's Simon. It's a bit ambiguous though, and I don't think it is, because Cleopas and his companion go to tell the 11, which includes Simon, who has seen the Lord. Perhaps if we're thinking that Cleopas was going home, he might have not just been with a friend. Maybe it was with his wife. His wife Mary is mentioned in John 19:25 as being at the cross, so it would make sense that they were walking home together. But it doesn't really matter who it was. But what matters is that it is someone who Cleopas can process, with whom Cleopas can process what has happened what's happened with on his walk to Emmaus, which was only 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they make it back that same evening. So they're walking along and they're having a chat, trying to make sense of all they'd heard and seen. The last they saw of Jesus was when he was laid in the tomb. He was definitely dead. The soldiers had made sure of that. But things were emerging that they weren't expecting. What do you think they were asking at this point? What were the questions they wanted to know the answers to, do you think? What are the questions you've always wanted to know the answers to when it comes to the resurrection? Maybe it's, how did he find clothes to wear when he came out? Did he pack a suitcase? That's one question that comes out. There's all sorts of questions. What makes what things that aren't answered because they don't really matter so much, but maybe questions that come up. Anyway, they're having this chat and they turn it over and a stranger walks up. If I was them, I wouldn't want a stranger to walk up and start a conversation. I'd want to be left to it. It's a bit of an irritation, to be honest. They just wanted to go home and lie in their own beds. But he does, and despite the fact that they should know who he is, they don't, and he doesn't give it away. He wants to see where they're at this point. Verse 16 has an interesting translation in the NIV. It says they were kept from recognising him. Who kept them? Well, that's my first question. But if you dig a little deeper, more literal translations say their eyes were holden. Well, who held them? They clearly couldn't see what was right before their eyes. A more helpful way of paraphrasing it, I think, is in the Good News translation, which says, they saw him, but somehow they did not recognise him. Or the Contemporary English version, which simply says, they did not know who he was. They were not expecting this stranger to be Jesus, so they literally couldn't see what was right in front of their eyes. I suppose the only way I can relate to this is a time where I went to a quiz in a pub in Derby, and someone said thank you for looking after their daughter when her mum died. It took me a long time until I realised it was the dad of a pupil in my class who had met many times on Parents' Evening. Context, situation, place, experience, it makes a difference to how you see someone. So Cleopas and his companion basically just couldn't see because they hadn't got their head round the fact that Jesus had been resurrected yet. None of it is making sense to them. The picture on the jigsaw has not yet been revealed, and what they had hoped, redemption of Israel, they believed hadn't come to pass. In their heart of hearts they were hoping for thunder and lightning perhaps, but the only thing they knew was who Jesus was and what they'd experienced with him, and the rumours of an open tomb and no body. They weren't sure what to think. You see, sometimes we need help in putting the jigsaw together. When the way things are working don't make sense, having a voice from the outside, here the subject of the confusion, which is helpful, help you to sort it out and point out a different direction to the one you're heading, makes a massive difference. Jesus seems a bit harsh here because he calls them foolish. Perhaps the word foolish is a bit strong, but he encourages them to put all the pieces together and reveal the big picture because there is something better to see. Cleopas and his companions walk with Jesus is so important for us to see and read about because it reminds us that doubts and discovery are a natural part of walking in faith. In fact, they are almost essential for faith. Jesus doesn't condemn the doubts and the questions of the two disciples, but works with them where they are and helps them to understand, discover, and put all the pieces together. In times of trauma, in times of change, in times of devastation, it is through our questions and searching for answers we gain a deeper understanding of who Christ is. That walk for Cleopas and his companion was really important because it helped them to process everything they had seen. And when they invited Jesus in, which would be the normal hospitable thing to do in that culture with a stranger who'd walked on the road and has nowhere to stay, they invited him to join for a meal. And then the breaking bread put the last jigsaw piece in. The walk home and the meal, it helped them make sense of everything. Excuse me. It helped them to put all that had been broken apart back together again. And the fear and the uncertainty and the stress that was holding their eyes from seeing was transformed into joy and to revelation. Nobody really knows where Emmaus actually was, just that it was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And I think that's okay. We don't need to know the exact location. But because what Emmaus symbolises for us are those places of discovery, where doubts are dealt with and questions are answered or just left behind. Emmaus reminds us that taking time out and time off to process is really important, whatever format that takes for us. For me, my sabbatical, I hope, will be my road to Emmaus, where I hope I will find home again after what has felt like a long time walking in this pandemic wilderness. The Welsh have a word for that wanting of home, that road of discovery, hiriath or hiraeth, where the deep longing we have to make sense of the world calls us to find a place that feels like home. You have a longing for it. Because on that road, we find anchors, the things that keep us steady. On that road, Jesus walks with us as we dig deep and discover more. So I've got a question for you. Well, 3 questions. Where are you making space to process all that you've seen and heard? And what part do your companions on the road have to play in that? What part does Jesus have to play in that? And the big anchor at the end of the road, the place where they really find home, the thing that brings Cleopas and his companion and helps them to discover the truth is in the meal. You can have all the knowledge in the world and have done all the processing, but it is in the breaking of the bread the final piece is put in place. This man who knows everything the 2 disciples needed is the man they were following all along. The answer we're looking for, the home that you long for. You know that's Jesus, don't you? It's Jesus. This is Jesus who has died on the cross, stretched out in his arms in love for you, and welcomes you home and promises there is more to life on this, because the victory is already won. Amen.